Hello and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with me, Matthew, and as always I'm joined by Joe. Today we're going to be thinking about investing for children and grandchildren. It's a topic that we're commonly asked, clients who are thinking about investments for the long term want to say, how best can I leave a legacy for my family? And we're going to think about the allowances, the products, and all those bits that are useful for the planning in this area. We're going to start with a bit of a jargon buster. So one of the things that, commonly comes up when we think about death benefits and leaving funds for family members is naming a beneficiary on a pension, and specifically what is an expression of wish form. So do you want to go over what that is, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Matthew said, I think this is a bit of almost needless jargon used by the providers, as is a lot of the case with financial advice. Essentially, an expression of wish form or nominating a beneficiary on a pension, that's something that is outside of your will because your pension is not included within your will. So it's most of the case just telling the pension provider how you'd like your estate that is your pension distributed between children, grandchildren and wherever else.
Perfect. And, a pension stays out of your will. So it's important that you fill in that form. And what you can do is include as many people as you want. So again, we often say a bit like your will, it might be that you're going to nominate a spouse, but then you're also going to nominate children or grandchildren. So you could say, 98% is going to go to my spouse, but I want to nominate the children with 1%. So that's certainly a sensible route to go down.
Absolutely. So moving in, I suppose, to the broader sense of the episode, we're looking at sort of how can we invest outside of our own allowances, so investing for children and potentially grandchildren. And by proxy, that's going to have some element of gifting within that, because you'll be taking your money, giving it to someone else to essentially invest. So that brings in a few different allowances that we'll just run through now, and just something to keep in mind throughout the course of the episode. So the most common one is the gifting allowance, which is £3,000 that you can gift without incurring any 7-year rule, and you can do that every single tax year. The one that we've spoken about quite a lot throughout the different episodes is gifts out of normal income. So that's if you can show what your income level is, what your expenditure level is, and any gap between that you don't necessarily need. Again, you can give that away without any 7-year rule coming in. The key with that one, obviously, is that you do have to make sure that you're documenting it. That is something that is claimed on death. Matthew, do you want to run through sort of the other one of the 7-year rule and your nil rate band?
Yeah. So, before we jump into that, I think it's important just to say we often have people who say, okay, how much can I gift before I have to pay tax? So the first answer to that is essentially you can gift as much as you want to whoever you want, as long as your estate is below certain thresholds. So the inheritance tax threshold of £325,000 each, and with a residential nil rate band topping that up to essentially £500,000 in most cases. So £1 million is available for a married couple. So anyone who is well below those figures could start to say, okay, I don't have to worry too much about gifting. It's more about, logistics and how I'm going to do it. But anyone who is above those thresholds needs to be more clued up and have a thought process to say, am I doing gifts out of surplus income that Joe describes, which is completely exempt? Am I using my gifting allowance of the £3,000 that Joe described? Or am I thinking about the 7-year clock, where I'm then trying to almost look at how long I expect to live for and how many 7-year clocks have I got? So £325,000 is that nil rate band. And essentially, any gifts that you make, so if I was to make a gift of £50,000 to Joe, that would sit in my estate, taking up some of my nil rate band for the duration of that 7 years. 7 years and 1 day after I made that gift, that would be completely disregarded, and I would have that full nil rate band available to me again.
Yeah, absolutely. We will come on to the nil rate band in a little bit later in the episode when we look at gifting into trusts, because there is a couple of different rules that we need to look at there. But I thought a good place to start with regards to sort of products that you can look at. Most people think about a junior ISA. I had one when I was growing up. I think a lot of people see that as almost the de facto what you should do for children and grandchildren. So with a junior ISA, you essentially have £9,000 per child that you can put into the ISA. Generally, with clients, we always say try use your own ISA allowance first, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't give it to a child or a grandchild in the future, but it does remain within your control. Whereas in a junior ISA, as soon as that child turns 18, it will essentially become accessible to themselves. They can either roll it into an adult ISA or just take it out for whatever reason that they might want.
Did you do anything exciting with your junior ISA?
Mine mostly went on funding university, so I was maybe one of the more sensible ones, but I've heard a few stories where people might have slightly enjoyed theirs more than others.
Yeah, I think junior ISAs are a great product for grandparents or parents who are wanting to save the excess for the long term. But as Joe and I have talked about privately quite a bit, it comes with that financial education package. And the bit that Joe's described is the perfect bit of control. You know, as soon as you put that money into the junior ISA, it's their money in the future. You might be a custodian of it up until they reach that age, but really, you know, it's their funds and they can do what they want with it. It's probably how you then package that to say it's towards university, it's towards a house deposit, it's towards a car, and it becomes less of a, that's my pot of money, and more, that's my future deposit fund.
Yeah, and I think it's, on that financial education piece, it's about getting the children involved as soon as possible. So if it is an invested junior ISA, which in my opinion probably should be the route that most people go down, because you've got an 18-year time horizon potentially, and you can grow a bit more. Get the children involved, look at sort of how much is in it this year. In a year, do a little mini annual review. This is what's happened, this is how much it is now. And I think the more you get someone involved in that, the more responsible they will be, because they've seen almost the effort that's gone into it, as opposed to just a lump sum that lands on the door at age 18.
And let's touch on that, where, you know, the two options would be a cash ISA or a stocks and shares ISA. What you said there was stocks and shares would make sense because of the time horizon. And I'd completely agree. You know, if you're starting that for a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, you're running it until at least 18. You're then saying there's a long period for growth. And also, you know, if there's a world event and markets were to fall, you've got that capacity for loss, that time horizon to allow for the funds to come back. And again, you're also, logically, you're putting modest amounts into this in line with your other bits. And like Joe described, to start with, you're saying, okay, am I in a strong financial position before I should do this? And I think one of my caveats straight away would be, you know, make sure your boat is sound before you start trying to help someone into your boat and as a lifeboat. Again, that's the element of, you know, concentrate on your own pension, ISA, and then once you feel like you've got more than enough for you, that's when you can start to do these extra bits as a bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on really quickly, if you don't have a junior ISA, if you were born, or not you obviously, but if your children or grandchildren were born between September 2002 and January 2011, it's most likely that they'll have something called a child trust fund, which is essentially the preamble to the junior ISA. The government, in some cases, topped it up to £500 when it was set up. And some people might have lost that. So you can go on HMRC's website to find out, if you do have anything in there, how much is it and how you can access it.
Yeah, and in most cases, you can transfer that child trust fund now across into an ISA if you're looking to consolidate them or have them in a safer place going forward. So yeah, definitely makes sense. The other thing when we look at investing for children is to think about the junior SIP. So to think about a junior pension. I've got a couple of clients who've said, you know, we've got some funds available which we want to leave to our son. And they've said, okay, well, he's also getting some money from his grandparents, so that's in an ISA. So we're not sure what to do with the money. We talked through the time frame for investing for a pension for him, and actually we thought that would be a great leg up in the pension planning point of view. So we've started putting money into a junior SIP for him. You can put in, you know, anyone who's got no taxable earnings, again, a junior would. You can put in 2,880 net, and the government adds £720. So that means that 3,600 is dropping into that pension. Again, that's invested in the same way that a stocks and shares ISA could be. And with that very long time horizon until their retirement, that's got a lot of opportunity to grow. And when we have, you know, annual reviews and catch-ups with them, you know, they're amazed at how it's done so far. And that has that potential to be a really, really good leg up for retirement planning.
Yeah, I mean, with junior SIPs, I definitely have this as a nice to have, not a need to have in the financial planning basket. I mean, from the child's point of view, they might be a little bit miffed that they're not getting 10,000 or whatever at age 18. But I do think, as Matthew said, it's really nice to have almost a little bit of a buffer for the child. If they can essentially try and explore other career opportunities and make mistakes because they've already got that head start on pensions. They might be able to pursue a career which might not be as well paid, but it's something they want to do because you've already set them up for starting off with their pensions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it comes back to those good habits again. My dad was an accountant, so when I was at university, I was doing budgets and reconciling them. Again, I know most people didn't do that, but that set me up really well with skills to look at money and think about money. And the idea of saying to a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, okay, you've got this, in a junior ISA, potentially this in a junior SIP, and the view of seeing how that performs over the long term might spark their interest in thinking about money, saving for the future. And again, it might actually just give them that head start to be more clued up and switched on.
Yeah, absolutely. And fast forward a few years, sort of child's turned 18, maybe in their early 20s, they're thinking about university and thinking about buying a house. That's obviously a time where, nowadays especially, it's a lot harder to get on the housing ladder, particularly if you're looking at renting. So that's something that we discuss with quite a lot of clients of, should I look at gifting a house deposit? If so, what's the best way of doing that? And there are a couple of different ways, both for the child and yourself. Matthew, you just want to quickly run through what a lifetime ISA is and how that might be able to help in that scenario?
Yeah, definitely. Bank of Mum and Dad is obviously the highest lender. So again, we see lots of people who are saying, how can I help my kids out? How can I help them with that? And one way is almost to say, okay, we're going to help provide the money to pay into someone's lifetime ISA. The amount that you can put into that is, £4,000 per annum. And again, that forms part of your £20,000 ISA allowance. There's then a bonus added to that of 25%. So that pushes it up to £5,000 essentially going in. And that's a really good way of someone saving for the future and being encouraged to do so by that bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. I always feel like I'm the one that talks about disadvantages here, but disadvantages of a lifetime ISA, you are only able to use it up to £450,000 house value. So a lot of people that might be buying in London or some of the more expensive areas of the country might not actually be able to use that. Another thing is, if you don't use it for a house deposit, there's a couple of different ways that you can look at that. So if you turn age 60, you can then access it, but that could be a long way off for an 18 or 20-year-old. And then the other way would be essentially withdraw that from the lifetime ISA. So you get a 25% bonus when you put it in. Yeah. You also get a 25% reduction when you take it out. And some people might think that's fine. 4,025 minus 25 will be back at 4,000. Doesn't quite work like that. If you have 4,000, that obviously gets topped up to 5,000 by the government. 25% of that is 1,250. So you'd actually only get 3,750 out. So it's always one where I like to think, make sure that you're planning and make sure that you know what it's going to be used for. It does need to be open for 12 months prior to a house purchase. So a lot of the time when I'm speaking to children of clients, that'll be like, look, get it started, get the ball rolling with maybe the minimum contribution of £25. And then when you get closer to the end of the tax year or purchasing the house, that's when you can start to add to it a little bit more once it's a bit more certain.
Yeah, I think they're really good ideas and they're really good way of squirreling away a bit extra. I think the maximum house price of 450,000, as you said, if someone's buying at the south of the country, it could easily be hitting that. And then they may feel like they've not done well from the product, as you say, with the potential penalty, unless they're then leaving it until 60, and leaving it until 60 then feels like you might as well have put it in a pension. So I think, it's one of those things, like, it's nice to say there's a pot that I'm saving, and it's again creating that good discipline. And as a grandparent or a parent, you might be saying, okay, I'm going to pay in and I'm going to pay in, but you don't want to aimlessly pay in. You want to say, okay, when do you think you might buy? What sort of property you're looking at? Is that person buying with a partner? Again, have they already bought a house? Are there any other restrictions that might stop them from accessing or benefiting from it? And that's all the things just are worth thinking as they go through those bits.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose a tag on to this isn't necessarily our speciality as financial advisors in looking at the impact on the gifted deposit and how that might affect sort of lending criteria on the mortgage.
I think lots of mortgage brokers and mortgage providers are very switched on this area now. I think in the past maybe they weren't so much, but because with higher interest rates, we've seen more and more people gifting deposits. It comes down to that money laundering of showing that the money was in someone's account and when was it gifted. And again, it comes back to that documentation. So, for me, I always say to people, it's your money, you can do what you want with it. So again, gifts are fine, but it's just making sure how much did we gift, on what date, what did we call the transaction when we paid it across, just so if in 7 years' time or 20 years' time someone said what happened there, it's a clear audit trail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose what we're going to talk about next is student loans, which I think pretty much comes hand in hand with house deposits, because when I speak to clients, they go, should I pay off my child or grandchild's student loan, or should I leave it, give them the loan, and then we'll help for a house deposit? And I think a lot of the time it does come down to personal preference, although a couple of changes recently, particularly with sort of increase in the sort of amount of time before a loan's wiped out, more pushes people towards let's leave student loans as they are and look towards the house deposit. What's your sort of thoughts on that, Matthew, with regards to house deposit or pay off a student loan?
So the previous approach to that was always, it's not real debt, so it doesn't really count. So when you're going for a mortgage and you're looking at that, mortgage providers don't really take your student loan into account as proper debt. So if you're likely to take on more debt, then don't pay down your student loan, because it's not real debt from their point of view, and you're then going to potentially take on that. So in that logic, if you owed £20,000 on a student loan and you had £20,000 in your bank, you could say, I can pay that off and then I don't have to worry about the interest. But really, if you were going to do something with that money in the next 5 years, 10 years, you might say, actually, I'm just carry on naturally paying down the student loan. That was always the traditional answer. But as interest rates have gone up and the costs on the interest on the various plans have also gone up, there can be a more sensible conversation to be had about, okay, well, if I am likely to pay it off in my lifetime, I should then be using the cash that I've got to go against it. But my lived example is I've still got a student loan that I just let naturally be paid off, because I would rather use funds towards a house, a mortgage, a car, rather than towards my student loan.
Yeah, I think with the newer ones, so the newest plan for student loans, you pay 9% of your income over 25,000, paying it back, and it's wiped out after 40 years. The previous plan that just stopped in 23 was 9% over 28,000.
Yeah.
So that's where you'd more be thinking, how much are you going to earn over the course of your career, and are you going to pay it off? And I mean, I've seen some student loans that are sort of 60, 70, 80, 100,000 pounds maybe. And at that point, you're never going to pay the full value back. But if you do have a much smaller loan, then it might make sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's all about factoring in, personal circumstances and what you're looking to do. But it's just, I think I heard one story where someone did pay off their student loan, but the student loan company were very slow to allocate funds that went in, and actually carried on taking a deduction from someone's pay. So if someone does, pay off their student loan, you've got to definitely look at your pay slips and make sure that you've not been, getting hit twice there. But yeah, I don't like to sit on the fence too much, but I think the sort of, it depends on the circumstances and what someone's looking to achieve is a very, sensible approach here. If someone won the lottery, pay it off, because why not? Or actually, if you're going to stop working, then maybe you're never going to pay it back. So maybe that's the wrong answer completely. But it's that approach of, what you're looking to do, and can that money be better used for you? If the answer is yes, then carry on with the loan.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're now going to sort of transition in and go from what are relatively simple products in the ISAs and SIPs and lifetime ISAs to what can be perceived as a bit more of a complex product. We touched on them slightly, or touched on part of them slightly in the last episode in the offshore bond, but we are now going to start talking about sort of how you can use an offshore bond within a trust to try be beneficial from a few different reasons. The main reasons why people look at sort of gifting into trust, I suppose the two main ones are, one, IHT tax efficiency, because after 7 years, it may be outside of your estate and reduce it that way. And then also bloodline protection as well. So ensuring that money that you want to gift to a child or grandchild, stays with them and it doesn't go away to potential ex-spouses or that sort of thing. Matthew, do you mind just giving us a brief overview of sort of the two different types of trusts that you could potentially use to do this type of gifting?
Yeah, definitely. So as Joe describes, people come to us and talk about trusts and investments mainly because they're thinking about IHT efficiently, and they're also thinking about the bloodline protection. The two types of trust that we tend to look at, full of jargon, a bare trust and a discretionary trust. The easiest way to distinguish between the two is with a discretionary trust, you have discretion as a trustee for anyone who you want to benefit, whereas the bare trust, you're naming who you're wanting to benefit, and they might have fixed access for potentially at 18, for example, if we're looking at junior beneficiaries. So the discretionary trust is almost to say, I want to gift money to classes of beneficiary or classes of people, and I want it to fall out of my estate, so I'm no longer going to benefit from it. But I might be able to say, future grandchildren that haven't been born, they can be in a discretionary trust, where that's a lot harder in a bare trust to nominate people that don't exist yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that they work are slightly different with regards to a bare trust. That's essentially treated as a PET or a potentially exempt transfer. So because you're only gifting it to one person, it essentially treats the trust as an individual. And therefore, the 7-year rule, you could gift an unlimited amount into that trust and it would fall out after 7 years. If you were to die within that 7-year period, it goes the same as Matthew said. I think in the last episode of it, it absorbs your nil rate band of 325,000. And then if the gift's anything more than that, it would be taxed at 40%, with, I suppose, a little bit of a caveat that if you die after 3 years, you'll start to benefit from what's called taper relief, which means you don't pay the full rate of IHT at 40%. It might be 32, 24, 16, 8 or 0 if it's after the 7 years.
Yeah, definitely. And people who are looking to put money into trust are thinking about the nil rate band traditionally. So they're trying to say, okay, I'm going to structure my gifts into trust in that 325,000 bit, so there's no immediate tax to pay. I think that definitely makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then discretionary, as Matthew said, you are benefited by more control. You can appoint yourself as a trustee, and then therefore, if you do have more grandchildren come on, if you have changing circumstances, you can look to change with how the trust might be distributed. But it does come with more admin and a little bit more of a strict charge potentially with inheritance tax. So because you're not just gifting to one individual, you're potentially gifting to multiple individuals. Instead of it being what's called a PET, a potentially exempt transfer, it then moves into what's called a chargeable lifetime transfer, a CLT. And this essentially means you have 325,000, that nil rate band that you can put into the trust in any 7-year period without being charged. But if there is any more than that 325,000, instead of HMRC going, oh, well, we'll wait till he dies and then work it out, they will say you've gone over your allowance of the lifetime gift that you can make into the trust. Therefore, we're gonna charge you what's called the lifetime rate of inheritance tax, which is 20% as opposed to the 40% on the excess.
Yep. And if we zoom out and just take a step back and say, why are people putting money into trust? It is that exactly that we described. It's okay, I don't want to benefit from it. I want to pass it on to either nominated people or potentially, a class of beneficiaries. And I then want funds to be available for them to take in the future, but I don't necessarily want them to have it immediately now. So that's why we're thinking about trusts. And then when people are looking at those trusts, that's when the numbers that we're talking about become more important to think, which one of these avenues do I want to go down? And the really powerful thing with this for investing for the long term is to say, with both approaches, those trusts can be invested for the long term and they can carry on growing essentially.
Yeah, and not to wade too far into trusts and taxation, because it is an inherently complex area of financial advice. And if you are looking at this, you should always look to speak to a financial advisor. And it might be the fact that you'll have to speak to a financial advisor in connection with a solicitor and potentially maybe a tax advisor for this. But when you're looking at sort of gifting, the order of gifting comes into account, where you might need to look at whether you're making a PET or a CLT, what order do you put them in? Because if you make them in the wrong order, you can essentially have a a higher tax charge than would potentially be the case if you died within those 7 years. But I don't think we should go any further than that right now, more just covering it off as a little bit of a point.
What we're going to say now falls in line with, what would we do with the investments within the bonds. So again, if we're saying that there's a trust on either approach, we could put that into a bond, and that could be the investment that then is available to pay out income or capital to those nominated beneficiaries. We like this with an offshore bond because it's simple from a taxation point of view. There's no annual tax return that's required because it's not income producing. As we've described previously, it might be a return of capital, and that works well. So that allows the trustees to distribute funds or to distribute capital in the future. There is the potential of a periodic charge, which is reviewed every 10 years, and that tends to be 6% of the excess above the residential nil rate band in a simple trust. Again, we're not going to touch on that in too much detail because someone who is looking for advice in this area would talk to, as Joe said, us, a solicitor, potentially a tax advisor, and we'd have that packaged up together. But essentially what we're saying is you can have your funds invested in line with your approach to investment risk, and as the trustee, you can change that, you can adjust it, and you're not having to set a regular income that comes out to beneficiaries. You can say, okay, we'll change that, and it might be, someone's now going to university, let's assign them some money. Someone's now wanted to buy their first house, let's assign them some money, and the trustees have got that decision.
Yeah, and I think that's where the big benefit comes from in investing in a offshore bond as opposed to something like just a general investment account in a trust. Because if you were to make a gain within the trust, it's charged at the trust rate of tax, which is 45%. Whereas, as Matthew said there, by investing in a bond which has different segments, if at one point you're wanting to give a certain amount away to one of the beneficiaries, you can assign it from the trust to the name of the beneficiary, and then the beneficiary can encash it in their name and be charged potentially nil tax or basic rate tax, as opposed to that additional rate, trust rate of taxation.
Definitely, and I think crucially a few bits that we haven't really touched on much is, the bloodline protection comes into it because you're not actually putting it into the name of your beneficiary. So again, someone who is named as a beneficiary could have a divorce, could go bankrupt, could even pass away, and these assets would be still outside of their estate, so there wouldn't be any inheritance tax, or there wouldn't be any considerations for the divorce and other things. So I think crucially, that's where trust can be a really powerful tool. And there is an extra layer of complexity as we describe, but it does give you that extra control and flexibility, which lots of people find really, really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it very much is just another arrow in the quiver of inheritance tax planning. It wouldn't be all just looking at trusts. It would be looking at all the other options. First of all, spend it, which is the easiest way when you're looking at inheritance tax. But yeah, as Matthew said, it's a nice way to protect a gift while potentially being inheritance tax efficient as well.
Definitely. And I think, we touched on it with the jargon buster at the start, but pensions, again, are still a really good way of passing money on down the generations. Yes, with the changes to the rules that are proposed, they are going to fall part of someone's estate for inheritance tax. But, when people have put money in trusts or gifted money, they might actually be below their nil rate band with figures. So therefore, a pension can still be passed on to a spouse or children or nominated beneficiaries, and that can then be used by them for income. If someone passes away before 75, that's a tax-free income to their beneficiaries. And if someone passes away after 75, it's just taxed at their marginal rate. So as we described at the start of this video, it's really important to think about your nomination, to think about how that's structured, and rather than just having the simplest approach of maybe nominating 100% to a spouse, it might be worth adding a percentage to children or potentially grandchildren, because you can almost have a family committee meeting on death where those percentages can be tweaked. If you're not named at all on there, it's harder for the pension provider to say, oh, I can see why we should adjust those and pay them out to these individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've rounded that up quite nicely there, Matthew. What we'll do now, we'll jump on sort of the listener's question of the week. One that we get quite regularly: is it better to save into a junior ISA directly with the child, or keep it within your own estate and sort of gift it every now and then? What are your thoughts on that, Matthew?
I think it's a tough question because it comes down to the individual circumstances and the objectives. So I think it depends what the goal is. I quite like the idea, like we've described in this episode, of saying financial education and gifting into an ISA come hand in hand, and that individual isn't then getting the money at 18 and then saying that's a lad's holiday or that's money that's wasted. It's going towards a car, university or education or a house deposit. So I think, that comes down to the individuals and knowing the people. I think there's also, quirks where you could have a disabled beneficiary who actually, the funds being in their name could stop them being able to benefit from things like benefits or care. Again, you've got to think about that for the individuals. But in general, it's an art, not a science, and whatever works right for that family. We know it's tax efficient and we know it's nice to build up money in a junior ISA, but actually as a parent, you might say, I'll have that money in my name and then in the future, I can allocate it when it feels right. We've seen examples where trusts have helped protect individuals, especially when it comes to things like death benefits, that, at the age of 18 to get a large gift dropping into your name versus a trust where, a sensible individual is saying, okay, we can give you this and we can help you with this. It can really be life-changing. So I think I'll sit on the fence slightly, but it's that element of, what's right for the family and the circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm probably in a similar sort of mindset to yourself. I think by investing early with children, it's a great way to get them involved in finances. I mean, you hear a lot of the time about financial education in schools isn't always there. This is a great opportunity to introduce them to it early and get them as responsible investors early, which will benefit them throughout their life. So I think they're really positive. It's just about sort of getting that education piece right, so that it doesn't get squandered.
Definitely. And I think, one of my biggest bugbears is that there isn't more financial education in schools. And again, people aren't talking about tax codes, investments, pensions. I think the more we can do things like these episodes to try and, push the information. Again, we should probably do an episode specifically for schools just to sort of say, these are the basics and how here we can build on them. But again, it comes down to that. What's the relationship between the grandparent and the parent and the individual? And can that be a positive tool for someone? If the answer is yes, then that's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Please comment if there's anything interesting in this episode or if you've got any questions. And as always, we'll see you next week for our next episode.